Welcome back. If you just joined us, you're watching the news at 10, broadcasting on Channels Television live from Lagos. President Muhammadu Buhari is expected any minute now to address the UN General Assembly. Phyllis from the presidency says his message will focus on insurgency and the battle against Boko Haram. The president is also expected to touch on happenings in Nigeria, particularly on his economic programs, and focus on his administration. Yesterday, he met with the Chinese president Xi Jinping. During that meeting, they both talked about oil theft and the reorganization at the NNPC. Forming a united front against terror is the only way to stamp out insurgency in the world. That's the view of world leaders attending the ongoing 70th UN General Assembly in New York, while U.S. President Barack Obama vows to defend America's allies as he seeks the cooperation of member states. Russian President Vladimir Putin calls for mutual respect, even for the principles of the UN Charter. Our correspondent Adeshawa Josh reports.
It's the 70th UN General Assembly, and member countries from Europe, America, Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere around the world are attending the summit, which the United Nations says is a crucial one. Over 37 heads of states and governments are in this room, and most of them will be addressing key areas that affects their mutual development. Flagging off the assembly, the UN Secretary General in his opening remarks says poverty must be tackled by the body.
We have about half of what we need to help the people of Iraq, South Sudan, and Yemen, and just a third for Syria. Our response plan for Ukraine is just 39% funded. And the appeal for Gambia, where 1 in 4 children suffers from stunting, has been met with a silence. Numbers this low raise the suffering to a new high. People need emergency assistance, but what they want even more is lasting solutions.
The speech of the United States President drew a very loud ovation, and apart from the fact that it was critical of issues bordering on terror, President Barack Obama singled out Russia as one of the countries whose policies is aiding the Syrian crisis.
I will never hesitate to protect my country or our allies unilaterally and by force where necessary. But I stand before you today believing in my core that we, the nations of the world, cannot return to the old ways of conflict and coercion. We cannot look backwards. We live in an integrated world, one in which we all have a stake in each other's success. We cannot turn back those forces of integration. And if we cannot work together more effectively, we will all suffer the consequences.
Though Russian President Vladimir Putin agrees terror should be stamped out of the world, he says it has to be done according to the principles of the United Nations Charter. Most of the world leaders here agree the issue of terrorism should not be taken lightly, and in spite of their obvious differences,
there would be no other rules left but the rule of force. We would get a world dominated by selfishness rather than collective work, a world increasingly characterized by dictate rather than equality.
There is a consensus that it will take a united front to deal a decisive blow on terrorism. Adeshawa Josh, Channels Television News.
Joining me now to discuss today's addresses at the UN General Assembly is the former permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador Martin Zuhumubi. You're welcome to the News at 10.
Thank you very much, Marachi, for having me.
Well, what a day of speeches it has been. Well, since the afternoon that started with UN Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon, he talked about, of course, terrorism, global terrorism, the fight against it, but he also focused on poverty, fighting poverty. He mentioned a few countries like Sudan, like Ukraine, where he's mentioned that there should be eradication of poverty, but he missed Nigeria. He didn't mention that. You think that was done on purpose?
Well, it's very interesting that he didn't mention Nigeria. But don't forget that there are new indications emerging that Nigeria is moving very quickly on the path of economic development. Only last year, Nigeria was indicated as the largest economy on the continent. And until very recently, with the dip of the oil prices, things were looking really, really upward, economically speaking, about our great country. But there are more pressing things really which must be on the table with respect to Nigeria rather than the economy. I'm not saying that the economy is not important. The issue of terrorism, and that of course merges with the global trend of terrorism from Iraq to Syria to Yemen and all of that places. So, and even to parts of Eastern Europe. So I think the General Assembly the 70th session is going to be really, really very heavy on how best to tackle to address the problem of terrorism.
And that seems to be a recurring problem every year. For the past 5-6 years, the UN General Assembly has been discussing global terrorism. Do you really think we're making progress towards curbing?
I'm afraid there have been more talk than action. And of course, the history of terrorism needs to be fully understood and analyzed. At this moment, the entire of the Middle East region is in turmoil. Perhaps Africa would have been next, but for some providential factors which made it not so difficult, not so easy to slide into that situation this year. But it is a real threat. And the earlier we dealt with it, the world took it more seriously, the better for us all. Look at the consequences of terrorism in the Middle East and the surge in the migration crisis that is now confronting not just the Middle East, but even to Europe. Imagine if we have more implosions from other regions of the world. People must not forget that the concept of global village is real, and that when trouble bursts out in any particular region, there is no way the region adjacent to it or close to it can be free from it. So the 70th session of the UN General Assembly is right to focus on economic challenges, but also more particularly on addressing the scourge of global terrorism.
Well, let's bring in the VOA's Margaret Bashir now. She's been covering the UN General Assembly all day today. Margaret, thanks for joining us on the news at 10. Well, Margaret, you did hear all the speeches today. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, as well as President Barack Obama, and then the Russian President Vladimir Putin, all three leaders focusing on the issue of terrorism. Do you think that all leaders really had a determination this time to do more than just talk about fighting global terror?
Well, I think they have to do more than talk about it. If they don't act, they're going to be, they're going to be out of jobs, because we can't see this spread of so-called Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, all these groups. They're threatening state sovereignty in many places. So they have to act, and they realize that.
And what did you make of other issues that the leaders raised up, especially climate change? We did hear President Vladimir Putin saying that Russia was going to cut down on some of its greenhouse gases right before the target of 2030.
Right. Well, everyone is trying to build political momentum towards the COP21, which will happen in Paris at the end of this year. And so they're trying to announce some of their commitments now. And I think that's very important, because we have to see that there's the political will there to reach a real agreement in December.
And Ambassador Humobi, you think that climate change will be something that President Muhammadu Buhari would speak about at the UNGA?
I should imagine so, because I believe the president will seriously consider going to Paris for that COP21. And Nigeria and African countries cannot pretend that the negative impact of climate change will not rub off disastrously on us if remedial measures are not taken urgently.
And don't forget, we're looking at climate change not just as a natural issue, an environmental issue. It is also a security issue, because, as for instance, we've seen in Africa, as lands dry up, as water goes away, as the temperatures rise, cattle grazing patterns change, people move, it causes problems between tribes. So it's also a security issue on a certain level.
But Margaret, did you hear any discussions or any addresses that particularly focused on what's going on in Africa? I remember President Barack Obama talking about the crisis in Libya, where he said that the U.S. was supposed to have done more than just kick out General Muammar Gaddafi, that the U.S. should have done more for Libya.
Right, he was speaking about the coalition, not just the United States. And, everything is always easier in hindsight, as they say. And so he did recognize that the coalition should have done more to fill the power vacuum that was left behind by Colonel Gaddafi. And now we have two rival governments in Libya, and this has led to giving political space for terrorist groups, including Islamic State. And it's also contributed significantly to the migration and refugee crisis, with people escaping from Libya using smugglers to get across the Mediterranean to Italy. So that was the primary African crisis he focused on there. He did speak a little bit later at a UN peacekeeping summit that he co-chaired, and he did speak of the problems in Africa and South Sudan and Darfur and other parts of the continent. And 30,000 new troops and police were committed by European and other countries to peacekeeping, which was a significant accomplishment today.
Well, thanks a lot, Margaret. Let's turn now to Ambassador Humobi. President Muhammadu Buhari will be making that speech to the UN General Assembly in just a few minutes, we hope, before we end this bulletin. Let's anticipate some of the things that he will say. Of course, terrorism right in front with Boko Haram insurgency up in the north. What else do you think the president will mention in that speech?
I think he will also talk about the climate change issue and what we anticipate should come out from the COP21 in Paris. I think he will also talk about, of course, the undying question of Nigeria's quest for a permanent seat on the Security Council. That can't be wished away, and not much progress has been made on that, but it remains an eternal desire of Nigeria that the Security Council should be expanded, and Nigeria deserves to be given a permanent seat on the Council. These are some of the issues, but of course our domestic situation, the progress that has been made to address some of the fundamental issues that bedevil our country at this time.
Ambassador Martin Zumobi, thank you for joining us on the News at 10.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And when the News at 10 returns, lunar eclipse seen across Africa and Europe. That's in a moment. Please join us again.